Welcome to the sixth video in this series on the externalist theory of Portalism. Portalism holds that a realm of subjective experience exists, as well as a physical realm, which we know of as the world. In holding that both subjective and objective realms exist, strictly speaking makes Portalism a form of contemporary dualism. I call it contemporary dualism because the locus of the mind is in the world, external to the body. Thus, Portalism is neither Cartesianism nor is it property dualism. As a form of dualism, it falls to Portalism to explain how the two realms, being the mental and the physical, causally interact, which would be impossible if either the reductionist explanation of the physicalists or the single-path causal highway of the epiphenomenalists is true. Portalism holds that the causal pathway between physical and mental flows both ways. So in support of this claim, which is essential and necessary to the theory of Portalism, in this video I will make the case for dual-path causality. What then is a cause? Science and physicalism assume the reductionist explanation of causality in that every physical event has a physical cause, yet many are skeptical, holding that we can never see the cause, a cause not being a thing in the world. In David Hume's famous example, the cause of the yellow ball being set into motion after being at rest is that it was struck by the cue stick, and the subsequent cause of the red ball being set into motion is that it was similarly struck in turn by the yellow ball. But if I had never before seen billiards or anything similar, there is no possibility that I could predict the action of the red ball prior to its being struck, based only upon the action of the yellow ball or of the cue stick, because I cannot see the cause. Again, causes are not things in the world. I cannot hold a cause in my hand. It has no mass, form, extension, number, charge, or spin. In Hume's opinion, the best we can ever do is to infer the cause of an event. Although it is certainly true that all effects have a cause, and it is also true that causality is necessary to the manner in which we temporally order events, it nevertheless remains that the cause simpliciter amounts to no more than a form of intuition, which is reasoned a priori. If the physicalist argument for causality is that all physical events have physical causes, then there would seem to be a dependency established between the event and the cause, as there could not be one without the other. If that is the case, then to argue causality at all would be to claim that physical events that have causes are events that have causes, which would be both tautological and begging the question. Nevertheless, as a metaphysicist, I have no problem granting that causality exists in the objective realm, but only as an unobservable physical property, an intuitive understanding, or an inferred act. Why then should reductive physicalists be resistant to granting the same admission to mental events in the subjective realm? The answer is that they reject the existence of such a realm, continuing to insist that mental events, if they exist at all, arise from and can be correlated to neurological activity, and they continue to cling to this intuition despite the lack of any scientific evidence to support it. Most physicalist or property dualist theories embrace mind-brain type-token identity, wherein the locus of consciousness is embodied inside the cranium. Reductionist theories search for neural correlates to mental states, while others uncomfortably admit that although mental states may exist, it doesn't matter because they can have no effectual influence whatever on physical events. This school of thought is called epiphenomenalism. It is a form of property dualism, and it holds that mental states are dependent upon physical functions but are not causally reducible to physical states. This means that because mental states cannot cause physical events, they are therefore meaningless causal dead ends. In effect, epiphenomenalism admits that mental states exist, but so what? Since they are unable to causally affect anything physical, what good are they? For them, causality is a one-way path only, from the physical, the brain, to the mind. If mental events exist at all, then the brain must cause them, and it can never be the other way around, as to entertain such a thought would be dualistic, amounting to the admission of the existence of something non-physical outside of the physical world, specifically a realm of subjective experience, and that this subjective realm is causally empowered to initiate events within the physical world through causal pathways that can and do travel in both directions. Epiphenomenalists and reductive physicalists reject this possibility, and they are wrong to do so. If causality is, as the epiphenomenalists hold, a one-way path, and mental events are unable to cause physical effects, then some awkward questions are brought forth. If true, then Beethoven's Ninth was a neurological event, meaning that one day this gray mass of cells in Ludwig's head conceived the melody, commanded the hand to write it down, adapted Schiller's ode into lyrics while abiding by all the rules of Western music theory. Additionally, given the subject matter of the Ninth, we must conclude that Ludwig's brain was inspired by God prior to its decision to undertake this labor. This is to say that the brain is capable of composing music in much the same manner in which it receives chemical information that the bladder is full and needs to be emptied. If this explanation is too much to ask one to believe, then what is the alternative? The answer is that Beethoven spent much of his early life learning music and composition, the rules of which were dutifully stored in his explicit and procedural memory. At the same time, Ludwig, as mind, was in the world, experiencing the uncertainties of late 18th and early 19th century Europe, cultivating a religion and forming an understanding of the role of God in the world. One day he sat down at the piano and created a masterpiece, from mind, as mind was all Ludwig was, and all any of us can ever be. To believe that the brain, while going about its duty processing sensory information, suddenly became compelled to write the Ninth Symphony is a long reach, but that is exactly what must have happened unless we embrace the idea of dual-path causality, meaning that Beethoven at his piano, inspired by objects and states of affairs in the world, conceived the melody in mind, including parts from snippets of earlier work that he was saving, causally recalling the rules of composition from the neural connections in the brain's long-term explicit memory, and proceeding to write his last symphony. This is an example of dual-path causality in task performance, initiated from mind, carried out simultaneously in milliseconds, seamlessly and evenly manifested as thought. There is a strong thought experiment along these same lines that demonstrates the existence of dual-path causality. In this research study, a healthy woman participant is placed into a room by herself. The room is empty, windowless, and the walls and ceiling are painted white so as to be free of any sensory distraction. A piece of notepaper is slid under the door. She picks up the note, reads its contents, and collapses in a faint. We presume that the note held some horrific news, perhaps something like, "Your daughter has been hit by a car," or some other phrase sure to invoke overwhelming emotion. Within a split second, she becomes upset, fearful, and distraught to the degree that her blood pressure plummets and she goes into shock. The brain, ever homeostatically watchful of the body with an eye towards its own self-preservation, detects a sudden lack of oxygen getting up to the skull and immediately pulls the plug on consciousness, shutting down the portal and causing the body to fall unconsciously into a prone position so as to make it easier for blood to reach the brain. So there's nothing too surprising here, as everything happened just as it should have, except that the brain can't read. In memory, it stores the rules of English syntax and semantics, but language processing, the task of assigning meaning and context to sounds, text, or hand signals, occurs in mind. The brain can't do it. The woman reading the note interpreted its meaning, which caused the subsequent events to unfold. If instead the note had said, "Hi there, I think you're cute," other emotions may have been invoked, causing a different and hopefully less dramatic set of events. This thought experiment is demonstrative of the existence of downward causality, wherein a mental event causes a physical result. A far more sophisticated argument for downward causality was put forth in 1980 in a paper by Donald Davidson, where he famously introduces his theory of anomalous monism. Davidson hypothesizes that mental events can have relations with other mental events, and through these events have causal intercourse with physical events. This relaxation of the formerly rigid idea of causal pathways assumed by physicalists opens a considerable amount of blue sky in terms of explaining how thoughts can influence behaviors such as creativity and emotion, the results of these manifesting as physical events like laughing, weeping, or Beethoven's Ninth. Although Davidson's idea of dual path causality is necessary to Portalism, he does not abandon monism for either dualism or phenomenal externalism. Still, his out-of-the-box thinking some 40 years ago yielded this truly elegant theory based upon a bold rethinking of causal pathways and the new possibilities they can unveil. My point is that if downward causation exists, as I believe it must, then dual path causality is true, while nothing in the physical universe changes. Reality thus remains as it always has been, consisting of a physical realm, a subjective realm, and pathways of causality between them that always already were. Channeling Alfred North Whitehead, at some point one has to ask the question, why should consciousness exist at all if it has no effective or affective power? As recent experiments in quantum mechanics has placed the theory of causal closure in serious question, the reality is that there are no physical properties in the world that would deny agency to the mind and preclude it from directing the brain to perform an action, such as to move in a certain direction or to retrieve and furnish a memory. Finally, Portalism is a phenomenal externalist form of dualism, and as such must furnish replies to the following traditional questions concerning causal interaction. The first is, how can something totally immaterial affect something totally material? Explain how something without any physical properties can cause physical effects. In reply to this first question, the existence of immaterial things that affect material things is not unknown to science. The term material describes something made of matter. Gravity is immaterial, yet it affects material things. Gravity is a field, a totally immaterial force that acts upon anything with mass, and things with mass are considered to be material. Portalism holds that the all-encompassing horizon of consciousness is, like gravity, a fundamental force of nature, ubiquitous throughout the universe, and that it interacts autogenically and invariably with all living things through their portals, just as gravity interacts autogenically and invariably with all things having mass. This description stands as the explanation of how something totally immaterial can affect something totally material, and should be sufficient to answer this question. The next question involves the mechanics of causal interaction. In dualism, the mind is assumed to be non-physical and by definition outside of the realm of science. Thus the mechanism which explains the connection between the mental and the physical would therefore be a philosophical proposition as compared to a scientific theory. Explain this mechanism and exactly how interaction takes place. This question makes two assumptions. The first being that the mind is assumed to be non-physical and by definition outside of the realm of science. The second being that the explanation of the mental-physical connection will be a philosophical proposition and not a scientific theory. Portalism agrees to both of these assumptions. The locus of the mind is external to the body and is indeed non-physical, but its existence outside the realm of science is a limitation placed upon it not by Portalism, but by science. There is nothing precluding science from expanding its horizons to include a subjective science. in much the same way that physics expanded its ontology in order to adopt Maxwell's characterization of electromagnetism. Yet, in regards to the original question, the current state of science and its self-imposed limitations would indeed place the phenomenally external mind outside of it by definition. Given this, it follows that an empirical characterization of consciousness, as per the scientific method, would not be a possibility, leaving us with a philosophical proposition. But in response, it is worth pointing out that, being metaphysical, such is the case with any theory of mind. So all that is left now is to explain the connection between the mental and the physical, and how this interaction takes place. Portalism holds that the mind is manifested within a localization of the horizon of consciousness, individualized to a given organism through its portal. To restrict the explanation to the syntactical confines of the question, this portal mechanism is the connection between mind and brain, but it is at the same time so much more. Consciousness as mind is in the world, and through this being in affects a relationship of de facto identity through which mind becomes world by becoming absorbed by world. The world is disclosed to mind through the sensory modalities of the body, and the data they in turn provide to the brain for processing becomes disclosed to mind via the portal. Phenomenal experience of the physical realm is therefore instantaneous to the mind, as the world is exactly as it appears. Causal pathways between brain and mind world are bidirectional, and downward causality exists. The sensory modalities are always providing data in unreflective everydayness, but can be focused at any moment by the intentionality of the mind, directing the brain to move the body and or perform any acts necessary in response to the intention of the mind. The mind has agency, and all of these processes are perpetual and ongoing, involving only milliseconds, whether in wake state or dream state, as long as the portal is open. The portal manifests mind, facilitating the synthesis of consciousness and world, the knower and the known, as a totality of subjective experience. Thank you for viewing this video on Portalism's concept of dual path causality. The seventh and final video in this series comprises my argument for the cogency of Portalism and its plausibility as a metaphysical theory of mind. Causation can be a complex subject, and it is important that the viewer understand that I go into much more detail on this subject in my book, Portalism, an Externalist Theory of Consciousness, which is slated for release in the spring of 2022. For more information, visit the website shown here. Thanks, and I hope to see you for the final argument for Portalism.